Welcome back to Module 5 of Pillar 2 of the Men of Action program. This is the one where we are going to talk about single points of failure. I'm going to be talking about single points of failure. We're going to be talking about a little black box, and we're going to be talking about training your replacement, which are all kind of different names for the same thing. And what we talk about in single point of failure is when you have some sort of activity, business, whatever it is, where there's one person that seems to be holding up the entire process, or you have one person that becomes irreplaceable. So one person holding up the entire process is a single point of failure. When you have one person who makes themselves irreplaceable, even though they're not being exceptionally productive, they just make themselves irreplaceable because they know where all the bodies are buried, they know where all the keys are, they have all the passwords. When you have, they're the gatekeeper of all the processes in the business. That person becomes the little black box. And then the last thing we're going to be talking about is training your replacement and why that's really important in any kind of business that you have. So the homework assignment for this module is going to be the E-Myth Revisited. That is the book that I want you guys to read for this one specifically. So as far as training your replacement is concerned, or more importantly, the single point of failure, what you're going to find is you'll have a company where there will be a decision maker who you just can't ever get him on the phone. Whatever reason, you can't get him on the phone. He's having girlfriend problems or money problems or something like that. Or even worse, and he has a hard time speaking in a non-passive aggressive manner. When you have that situation, when you're getting suggestions instead of directives, now you've got a single point of failure, because every time you try to make a decision, with the decision maker involved and they're not available, or they don't make a decision. And then when you go ahead on your own and you make that decision, then you get your hand slapped because you made a decision without proper authority. So that would be one type of single point of failure. Another type would be, something similar, like you have everyone set up to build a house, and the guy who's supposed to lay the concrete to pour the foundation, he's just slow. No one can go faster than him because he's the one pouring the foundation. You find this all the time with different people. If you're on a football team, you can't go any faster than the center snaps the ball back to the quarterback. And if he doesn't snap the ball back in time, you get a delay of game penalty. There's a single point of failure all the time in several different businesses. And sometimes they're unavoidable. Sometimes they're just unavoidable. Like, for instance, if you have a business that relies on one star personality, and that star personality, he's the single point of failure. I remember one thing, I know this is going to be a weird example, but Tai Lopez, he had a bunch of investors in his company, and his company was called TaiLopez.com. Well, guess what? Guess who they can never fire? Tai Lopez, right? So he had created himself to be sort of a little black box where he made himself indispensable. I think you guys should all try to make yourselves indispensable, but I think you should also try to avoid having indispensable people in your company, because when you do that, you get into these situations, these impossible situations where basically your subordinates are dictating to you when and where you can, operate. And that's not a way to run a business. So it's very important that you identify the single points of failure in your company. For instance, if you have a company, where you have a social media company and you have a photographer who's just never on time and can't ever produce pictures, or I've seen several cases where there's a bunch of influencers that have photographers that just never get them back their edits, that's a single point of failure. You need to have multiple photographers that you can work with. That way you don't have a single point of failure. You may have an app that you're trying to develop. I would have several different developers working on different parts. And if you have one developer who just for whatever reason cannot produce, he can't ship his content, he can't ship his code as fast as the rest of them, you need to take that code, that assignment, and you need to give it to one of the other ones. And they need to be consistently competing with each other so you don't have a single point of failure. In several situations, when we flew the airplane in the Air Force, we would always try to avoid a single point of failure. We had 4 engines. If even all 4 of those engines went out, the airplane was like a glider, and we could use whatever hydraulic power was left in order to operate the ailerons, yada, yada, yada. And there was actually a way to use gravity to lower the gear. There were a bunch of different things like that you could do with the airplane so that we had avoided a single point of failure. If you ran out of fuel, there was a way to land the airplane. If you lost one of the gear, there was a way in order to compensate for the loss of that gear. If you had a fuel tank leak on one side or a fire in the aircraft, there was a way to put the fire out. There's no single one of the airplanes are built with redundancies, so there's never a single point of failure. Your business has got to be built the same way. You have to identify it. Now, little black box. What is the little black box we're talking about? It is The best example I've heard, and the most common one, is the receptionist at the doctor's office who knows the entire filing system. They developed the entire filing system, and they don't let anyone else touch the phones, and they don't let anyone else touch the appointments, the scheduling calendar. And they make themselves to, even though they get sick, they have pneumonia, they have to stay away, they get mononucleosis, whatever. They have to stay away from the office for a number of weeks. The entire office just goes to shit because they made themselves into this indispensable little black box. But they didn't do it in a good way. I want you all to make yourselves indispensable by providing massive amounts of value for people, creating win-win situations. Some of the stuff we talked about in the social networking section. I want you guys to be able to figure out how to create value by under-promising and over-delivering, consistently being the long-term solution for people. That's a way to make yourself indispensable. I don't want you guys to make yourself indispensable by being the guy who has the passwords to everything. I've definitely seen this before, where somebody's hired to update a YouTube or update a Squarespace or update a website, a blog, or whatever. And then all of a sudden that person gets fired, and then they go in with all the passwords and logins, and they change all the passwords, or they delete all the files or something. They basically sabotage the business, and you've left yourself open to that level of sabotage. Why? Because you had a single point of failure. You didn't have one person who could do this. You didn't have several people who could do this job. You just had one person who was able to do the job. You can't have an Air Force squadron with only one qualified pilot. You have to have several. You have to have several layers of redundancy. And that leads me to my third part, which is training your replacement. Here's the thing. You might be saying, well, Mike, I want to make myself indispensable, but if I'm training my replacement, by definition, I'm not making myself indispensable. And that is why I want you to read the book E-Myth Revisited, because one of the things that's very important is that as you become more of a specialist in the company, you become more valuable to the company. Once we figure out the most productive way to use a certain employee, one of the things that you understand is you need to figure out ways to get some of those things off his plate. So for instance, if you have a CEO who's also doing sales, he needs to learn how to train his replacement in sales so he can just focus on the business of being the CEO. If you have, if you have a quarterback who's also the punter, he needs to train someone else to be the punter so he can just focus on playing quarterback. I know that's a weird example, but like it's other situations. A great example would be like LeBron James. LeBron James can't bring the ball up every time. He needs someone else. He needs to train a replacement to bring the ball up so he can play off the ball. You're going to have situations all the time where if you're the pilot and you're taking these long distance flights, you need to make sure that the co-pilot is up to snuff so that if you need to take a nap or you need to do something else or operate something else on the aircraft, or there's some sort of emergency that happens and the co-pilot needs to be able to handle it, because for the overall efficacy of the business, you need to be able to train your replacement. If you're a receptionist and they want to promote you to office manager, well, you're never going to be able to be promoted to office manager because you're too valuable as a receptionist, because they have no replacement for you as a receptionist because you never trained your replacement. So it's one of the things we learned in the U.S. military is you should always be training your replacement. When you do so, you give yourself upward mobility. Please remember that. When you are training your replacement, you are giving yourself upward mobility. You're also becoming better at your craft. Teaching someone else how to do your job makes you more knowledgeable of your job. We'll discuss that later in the learn muscle section, but that is so important for you guys to understand, is that when you train your replacement, you avoid becoming the little black box, and you avoid, this is very important, you avoid becoming the single point of failure. You should always have a replacement for every position in the firm, the company, whatever group it is that we're talking about. You have to have several different layers. People need to have maybe one or two different jobs. I know this is a weird analogy, but one of my favorite books is called The Martian by Andy Weir. And there was a pilot, a backup pilot, and a third backup pilot, and a fourth backup pilot. There was a biologist and a backup biologist, an engineer. Everybody on the crew of that ship had two specialties, and then like a third backup specialty that they had. Like the main character, he was a biologist and an engineer. So he was like the backup engineer and the main biologist on the ship, right? So everyone had a job, and then they had a backup specialty so that there was some redundancy at every position in the company. If you don't have redundancy, nobody can take vacation. If you have redundancy, you have no upward mobility. If you don't have redundancy, you have a single point of failure, which can cause amazing disaster and a lack of productivity. Don't be the single point of failure, and create a company, create an environment that does not invite a single point of failure. Do not let people make themselves indispensable by hoarding all the processes themselves or by hiding all the passwords or whatever it is. Now, you should make yourself indispensable, but only do so, again, by providing massive amounts of value where they can't afford to have anyone else but you. If you're a top performer, you're going to get paid top money. The highest paid guy in the company is the CEO. The second highest paid guy in the company is the top sales guy. The third highest paid guy in the company is the head of sales. The fourth highest paid guy in the company is the second biggest sales guy in the company. Like, that's how it works. If you're a top performer, you're going to get paid as a top performer, but you don't want to get paid because you're a single point of failure and you're trying to extort your company. So remember, if you guys are if you guys have a process that you're trying to execute in your company, your business, whatever the activity is, you need to try to avoid a single point of failure. You need redundancies all over the place. This is a very important lesson we learned in the military. This is a very important lesson that you'll learn in life. Abundance is the answer to everything. You guys have heard me say that before. Single point of failure is also something you need to learn in your dating life. If you have a single point of failure, meaning somebody who's in the relationship, you guys have seen relationships before where you have a man and a woman, and then one of the two people in the couple, all of a sudden, develop a mental disorder, a number of other problems that can happen. There's no way to fix it. You're just kind of stuck in that relationship. You know why? Because you got married to somebody and the relationship has a single point of failure. The other person, right? I know it's a weird example, but how do you fix that? Redundancy. I've always said this. The answer is always abundance. The answer is always abundance. The answer is always redundancy. The answer is always to not allow individuals to make themselves indispensable to your processes. And the answer is to always train your replacement and always know who other people's replacement are so you don't end up with a single point of failure. Again, the homework assignment for this section is the E-Myth Revisited, a fantastic book for any of you who are thinking about starting your own company or just want to improve the processes in the company you're currently in.